If Jesus had not been raised from the dead, we would never have heard of him. So says the acclaimed Episcopal preacher Fleming Rutledge. I think she's right. The Romans crucified many dissidents, and there were a number of Jewish would-be messiahs who were killed, and none of their followers claimed that the person came back to life afterwards. If Jesus had not been raised from the dead, he would have been, at best, a passing mention in the history books. Like John the Baptist, he would have been simply viewed as another prophet who was killed for speaking his mind. And we wouldn't be here today. The first question we can ask is, what happened that first Easter Sunday? Theologian E.P. Sanders said that from the accounts we have, it looks very much as though the early Christians were struggling to describe something they knew had happened, but for which they were aware they didn't have good language. I think he's right too, and this partially explains some of the strange descriptions in the Gospel accounts. Let's briefly explore Matthew's depiction of events this morning. He has Mary Magdalene and someone he refers to as the other Mary going to the tomb after the Sabbath was over, at the dawn of Sunday. Why were they going there? In contrast to Luke, there is no mention of them going to complete the burial process in this account. Moreover, they have witnessed the stone being rolled in front of the entrance, so they had no expectation of entering the tomb. Matthew also tells us the tomb was now heavily guarded, but we don't know whether the two women were aware of that fact. Perhaps they went there because this was a suitable focal point for their grief. But it also seems quite possible that they went there in faith, wondering if what Jesus had repeatedly said could possibly occur, namely that in 3 days he would rise again. Matthew's grave scene is the most dramatic of the 4 Gospels. There's an earthquake, an angel who rolls away the stone, guards who faint in fear, and a divine message to the 2 Marys. In keeping with Jewish tradition, Mary has angels appearing at great moments within God's purposes, and the image of this angel sitting on the stone is perhaps a sign of ridicule at the futile efforts of Jesus' enemies to confine him to the tomb. Despite the high drama, its meaning needs to be interpreted by the divine messenger to the 2 women. Don't be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. And almost as if to drive the point home that Jesus is not here because he has been raised, the angel invites them to come and see the place where he was laid. The 2 Marys had witnessed the crucifixion, had seen Jesus being buried, had seen the outside of the tomb, and now they saw inside. The empty tomb is not presented as proof, but as a sign of the resurrection. It's important to note that Jesus did not raise himself from the dead. This was an act of God. That's Matthew's point in his vivid account of events. The angel then gives them a message. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has been raised from the dead. And as they run to tell them that Jesus will meet them in Galilee, with emotions of fear and great joy, they meet the risen Jesus on the way. He greets them with the word rejoice, adding, do not be afraid. And then he reiterates the angel's instructions for his brothers to meet him in Galilee. What is their reaction? They fall prostrate before him and held onto his feet. He had a real body. He wasn't just a spirit. The risen Jesus can be touched. And they worshipped him. The 2 Marys are both the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the risen Jesus. When Jesus later meets his brothers in Galilee, Matthew tells us that when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. The fact that both Marys and the disciples worshipped the risen Christ is significant, because Jews would only worship God, else that would be idolatry. But since the resurrection is an act of God, then the crucified Jesus, the Son of God, who has now been raised from the dead, is worthy of worship. This legitimate worship of Jesus is a new activity and is a feature of the life of the Church. Before moving on, I will only comment here on Matthew's mention that some of the disciples doubted, because I'll talk more about that next week. Discipleship contains faith and doubt. They are opposite sides of the same coin, and both can be incorporated into our acts of worship. We come to the risen Jesus both trusting in him and full of questions, and he will happily meet us there on the way. Remember, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. The second question we must ask is, what does all this mean? We're not alone in asking that question. Christ's followers ask the same questions too. Moreover, after Paul's incredible encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, he tells us he spent 3 years in the wilderness, no doubt trying to figure out what it all meant too. Their writings outline their thinking. For example, Matthew, like Paul, repeatedly presents Jesus as the one who fulfills the Old Testament scriptures. More specifically, however, in the resurrection, Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" has been answered. Jesus has been obedient to his calling, even suffering death on a cross, and because of his faithfulness, God has raised him from the dead, vindicating him before his accusers and demonstrating that Jesus is indeed God's chosen one, the Messiah. Without this divine act, crucifixion would be a terrible human tragedy. The early church, however, came to understand the cross and the resurrection to be the central event in God's salvation history. And because of that, we have to reread Matthew's whole gospel in light of the resurrection, beginning with the very first verse. If we do that, we will recognize hints of some of Matthew's perspective as to the meaning of these events. For example, he writes that the angel tells Joseph, "You are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins." And in the Last Supper, as we heard on Good Friday, Matthew records the words of Jesus concerning the cup. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The resurrection demonstrates that sins have been forgiven, and this is certainly part of the explanation. But there's more. Matthew hints that he, like Paul, regards the bodily resurrection of Jesus as the initial instance of the general resurrection of the dead that many Jews expected to happen at the end of time on the great day of the Lord. For example, he expresses this in mysterious apocalyptic language at the moment Jesus died, saying, "The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life." Seen in this light, the bodily resurrection of Jesus is a glimpse of the future in the present, the first fruit of a much bigger harvest to come. But please remember this point. Everyone in the first century knew that when you're dead, you're dead. No one ever imagined resurrection of an individual ahead of that general resurrection. and not all Jews even believed in that. One more meaning from Matthew is expressed in what the risen Jesus says to his brothers in Galilee. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and this fulfills a prophecy from Daniel. That degree of authority is how Matthew understood the extent of God's vindication of Jesus in the resurrection. And this is also why it is appropriate to worship Jesus, as well as God and the Holy Spirit. The resurrection changes everything. The story is told that in May 1543, when Nicholas Copernicus was on his deathbed, he was handed a copy of his most famous book, hot off the printing press. In this book, he explained in detail his mathematical reasoning for believing that the Sun was the center of the solar system, not the Earth, and that all the planets therefore orbited the Sun. At the time, this was utterly revolutionary, yet it took a few more centuries of research, building on the work of Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, before Copernicus's idea became universally accepted. Before that happened, there were many people, including the Church, who were anxious to protect the traditional perspective, and they did their best to argue against this new theory. People would rather try and patch up the defects in the old geocentric worldview than to accept anything radically new. One reason for this is that believing the Earth goes around the Sun is contrary to our daily experience. And even today, we still speak of sunrise and sunset as if it was the Sun that was moving around the Earth. One thing for sure, you cannot maintain both views at once. And switching from one perspective to another is referred to as a paradigm shift. Once you switch your worldview to the heliocentric system, your conceptual picture of reality will never be the same again. The resurrection is a similar earth-shattering event that also results in a paradigm shift, a complete change of thinking about reality. You see, the resurrection of Jesus is not merely an idea, or a metaphor, or a private religious experience for the chosen or susceptible few. It's part of history. Now, it's fair to say that to an atheist, or to someone who believes God is distant and does not interact with the world, the resurrection is impossible. And if you believe that God is somehow within the cosmos, resurrection is meaningless. And to someone who, following Plato, believes that when they're dead, their spirit or soul goes to be with the divine being, the idea of the resurrection is undesirable. Recall, Plato saw the soul as imprisoned within the physical body and was freed at death. This is not what the Gospel writers describe, nor what the early church proclaimed. No, the resurrection meant bodily resurrection, not that the soul of Jesus went to be with God. To be sure, from the descriptions given, it was a strange form of body. But if we believe this happened, then this is the first, and so far only, tangible form of the new creation the Bible talks about. What this also implies is that bodies are good. They're worth redeeming. Creation is not to be discarded for a purely spiritual existence. It's going to be rescued too. The transformation of the body is why resurrection means far more than forgiveness, important though that is, because it's part of God keeping his promises of a holistic salvation as described in the prophecies of Isaiah and elsewhere. A potent bodily resurrection is necessary to counter both the real physical consequences of our suffering and the pervasive pervasive extent of evil. And in the resurrection, God demonstrates that evil will not have the last word. Something radically novel was witnessed by Christ's followers, and world history has never been the same since. As I conclude, I come back to the two key questions, and I'll restate them. What do you think happened that first Easter Sunday morning? And as you reflect on that, I encourage you to read again the Gospel accounts of the resurrection and allow them to tell their own stories of the events witnessed. Once a person accepts the possibility of the resurrection, it throws up the second question. What do you think all this means? Like the Copernican revolution, the resurrection will turn a person's view of the world upside down. But ironically, it would also help make sense of everything in surprising new ways. Of course, this will bring loads of other further questions that will need addressing, and you're obviously welcome to come and talk to me about them as you wish. What I hope is that as we think over these questions, we will encounter the risen Jesus on our way, and so come to a position of worshipping him, like the two Marys and the disciples. Amen. Let us pray.